Hello, everyone. It's Sam Eckmann of Gold Derby here with Mathew Price and Ron Bochar, Emmy nominees once again for Outstanding Sound Mixing for The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel. Congratulations again on your latest nomination to the both of you. And this season, you're up for the episode "The Testi-Roastial," which uh, it quickly jumps into 1990. One of the flash forwards with one of these signature Maisel long takes, and it seems like a complex sonic sequence because there's the roast of Susie, the camera pans through a noisy kitchen, there's reporters, there's Elton John playing through it all. How do you have you gotten this down pat now of how to make an audience follow through those crazy sequences?
Ron.
Yeah.
Walk us through
I
it. What's
mean,
the trick?
they put so many of them in every episode in so many ways that you basically have to follow the action. You have to have it all down pat, but there's got to be something consistent all the way going through it. And usually it's dialogue. Usually it's couples talking, three people talking, four people talking, in and out of rooms with more people talking. The way that one worked, it was mainly driven by the music. And, our whole goal through that was to use the music, as the story point throughout. And, they actually, if you may not even notice, in the kitchen scene, the action of everybody that's happening in the kitchen is actually happening in rhythm with the music. There's a guy chopping that's right in the same range as Elton. I mean, within a few frames of a beat, so to speak. So it was fully choreographed, at least during the day of the shoot that Matt recorded. But then, for us, we had to embellish it all too to make sure we could hear it all above it. So it was a little bit different than normal oneers that they do because we didn't have to really focus heavily on keeping the dialogue consistent throughout.
We used playback through most of the opening sequence, and we dropped it out when we needed to for any dialogue, but it was mostly effects, and we knew that they'd have to probably fold all that later on. But Dan Palladino, who directed, wanted the rhythm, and we've done that a lot on Maisel. They have a lot of times they hire background people who are dancers because they have a very specific sense of timing and they're always going for that flow that professional movers have.
Right. Well, music is clearly very important to this series, and even sometimes that one has a very obvious song playing through it, but there's other times like in the golf sequence where I think each deal Susie makes has a different underscoring. How do you approach music in that way? Because sometimes it's not maybe the main focus of the scene, but still adds a lot to the pacing.
Well, in the case of this episode, and one of the reasons why we felt this one was an interesting one to put forward for an Emmy, was the way that they've used the music in this particular episode. I mean, that whole sequence you're talking there, we haven't really had that in a Maisel episode. And, for me, the way music is normally used in Maisel, it's either a source that maybe starts as a score piece and then sits itself back down into a radio or a record player or something from the kitchen, or I mean, you never really know where the source is a lot of times. But this episode was a complete change for us. We actually could play with music. We could actually use it. And I still had to deal with the normal issues of Maisel dialogue, being in there. But then we also, in those cases, we had a voiceover happening. We had what was actually being seen, happening. We had the music playing. We had background people in that whole section as well. So it was multi-layers all the way through that. And it was the most fun to mix.
Yeah.
Not to mention using contemporary music for a change.
Yeah.
like, well, 70s contemporary, not like 50s and 60s, like a lot of the standards and the classics that Maisel's known for.
It still gave it a feel, though. It's still, each one of those little bits gave it, the sense of time for sure. But it also, I don't know, it kind of helped every scene. It kind of colored every scene. It was great.
Well, Matthew, it's interesting you mentioned contemporary music, because this season, the final season, flashes forward in time several different decades across the season. Did you have to think about your work differently, about the tone of what you were doing, depending on what decade you were in?
Not really, because Maisel was always like, I think that was one of the earliest discussions we've ever had from way back in the beginning. I mean, do we want it to sound like it takes place in the 60s? And of course not. We want it to sound as high tech, clean as what we're used to hearing, in the present day, top level and all that stuff. There's no sense of making it sound like it was from a different era. I mean, that's all done with music and things like that. I didn't, I still mic people the same. We still have the same approach towards all the one-ers and all that, just a lot of radio mics and moving them all over the place. I mean, the biggest challenge in that episode was that we had to film all the golf course sequences in one day in daylight. So we were all running around this big golf course in golf carts with my sound cart strapped on the top, and just trying to get it all done before we lose light.
How appropriate that you're running against the clock for Susie's parking ticket, basically. It's
I guess that's
kind
true,
of the same setup.
Well, she still have 40 minutes left, right? Wasn't that the line?
Yeah.
So very, very real time. I would think another complex aspect is a lot of it happens in that Friar Club room, where everyone's voice is filtered through a microphone. There's lots of laughter and lots of people in the room, sounds from them. How do you go about making that sound right and that room sound full?
Well, in Matt's case, when he first records it all, he's got mics placed all over the room. You can speak on that, Matt, if you'd like.
Well, I mean, everyone who has scripted dialogue, and one thing that makes my life so much more structured, let's put it that way, on Maisel, is that they're very tight to the script. Every word, every comma, every period, for the most part. Although Alex Borstein does get a chance to play a little bit, but they're very strict script conscious. So I know who's going to talk. I don't have to worry about an improvisational type of setting, which happens in a lot of comedies where you never know who's going to talk at any time. But anyone with scripted lines, they're almost always got a video mic on them. We had two mics on the podium, one on either side, which you can see on camera. Those are working mics, because you never know which direction someone's head's going to turn. And if, one side or the other, they'll be off the mic. And when Tess came out, she sang live to a background track, which then by the end of it was kind of thrown off a little bit by Ron's trickery. So you could tell that she's singing to a background track. But that was the biggest challenge, her movement and all that. And then we had all the guys around the table, which were able to boom a lot because they're all pretty stationary. But usual production sound tricks, a lot of mics where we can, radio mics where you need them, and plant mics, podium mics, lots of mics.
And our preparation is always taking advantage of whatever he's recorded. So, we'll prep all the booms as well as all the lavs. And believe me, I take the cue of the size of the room based on what I hear in his boom tracks, and try to emulate that to give it a 5-0 spread of reverb in the room. So in the case of that whole Friars Club, the room itself has a spread of verb, and then the mics themselves, or the podium mic itself, has its own PA sound, so to speak, and it has to vary depending as if we're on close or if we're farther away. And it's a lot of manipulation, a lot of fun.
Yeah. Were the same tricks maybe used in that the temple scene? Because I think that fight between Midge and Susie is one of the most difficult parts of the season to watch these two friends just really rip apart their friendship. But that space, I feel like, would be so echoey and you really have to be focused on the dialogue in that moment.
Well, I love the sound of the space. I do like recording in churches and synagogues and stuff like that. I think it's always good when you hear the space. I think it gives the scene a lot more life. It adds personality. I mean, where you film is as important as what you film in a lot of ways, or at least in certain situations. I definitely wired them to help with to help Ron with any extra reverberation in the space, any extra echo. But we boomed a lot of that too, because it just sounds more open. And I gave Ron the choice. Yeah, it wasn't a huge scene from my perspective. It was really just two people speaking. So they both had radio mics, and we boomed it as well where we got close enough. But the cameras, Maisel's always moving around, and they don't shy away from holding a bunch of dialogue on wider shots where the boom wouldn't really sound good, especially in an echoey space like that. So I like the sound of the space, but I try to control it to some extent.
We take advantage again of whatever Matt gives me.
Well, I also was rewatching this episode, and there was a scene that struck me that really, I think, speaks to kind of the transformative power of sound, because you have that hospital scene where Harry is dying, and in one telling of the story, the room is very chaotic and very noisy. And then you have a second version where suddenly it is a very quiet, intimate space. It feels very soft in there. Can you just talk about the contrast between those two versions of the story?
Well, yeah, I mean, you nailed it. I mean, you're dealing with a version of chaos where outside of the room, we have an active, hospital taking place in that earlier scene. And, we've got people trying to come into the room. We've got a lot of activity within the space itself. And then later, especially when Harry's going to die on us, it's much more intimate. It's like later at night. The whole idea was that it's just between the two of them at that point, and everything else is pretty much closed down. We got rid of the phones. We got rid of any ambience. We got rid of any beeping. It just got very contained.
That's always the trick in the production mixer when we shoot hospital scenes, because they always bring in these machines to make it look right, but then they always somehow never can get them quiet. They're always beeping or humming or buzzing or whatever. So we us in the field, we do our best to shut them down. Not visually, but when we don't see them, they're off, just to keep it as clean as dialogue, especially in an intimate scene like that, like when it's just Susie and Harry.
Yeah. Well, this series, it has been 5 years, a very successful run. It's brought you an Emmy. What has it been like to say goodbye to this one?
Yeah, it's rough. It's one of those. It's one of those projects you work on where you think you really should just okay, I'm done. I've done the best on the best.
Yeah.
What else is there? You literally get to that point when the show ended, when the series for us ended on the mix stage. I mean, I was pretty overwhelmed with just the sadness of the fact that what should I do next? And that lasted a while until they said, hey, we're doing another series. So.
Yeah,
well, that's good.
Yeah, it was rough because we were on set. Obviously our last day of shooting, we were the way they scheduled it. Amy and Dan wanted to have as much of the cast there as possible, so we spent our last 5 days on the Gordon Ford set, which led to Midge's big stand-up that breaks her career open. But almost all the cast, the whole family were there. Joel was there. They even brought Imogene in, who we hadn't seen all season. So it was tough. There were a lot of tears. It was I spent 10 years on The Sopranos, which is one of the greatest shows on TV, and that was one ending. But something about Maisel was a special show. I mean, partly about doing a comedy where you get to laugh all the time, and it was the loveliest group of people. The cast was just every single one of them, and the crew. And I know everybody says this all the time, but I really mean it. It's hard. I'd be so ready to go back for more. I wouldn't think twice.
Yeah.
Another 6 seasons, 7th season. Yeah,
Yeah.
nobody wanted to really see it end. Nobody
No.
wanted to see it end.
No. We all wanted Midge to be a success.
Yes. Yes.
But
Well,
we
and
didn't want it to end either. You know?
in thinking about what comes next, because this, as you said, was kind of the best of the best experience, was there any sort of like a major key lesson that you had to learn on this show that you will definitely bring forward in your next projects?
Well, yeah. Everything I've done around it and in between, I mean, we all work on top level projects, but it really was nothing like the Maisel experience. The writing was so extraordinary. And as a sound mixer, those words, the voices are in my head. I wear headphones with a microphone that's very directional. And this is what I have to listen to these words all the time. So to listen to the Maisel dialogue was always a treat. Yeah, I learned to think on my feet in ways I never have before. I had challenges I had never had before, but I mean, every other show will pale in comparison, except for maybe what the Paladinos do next.
Yeah, in my case, it was always about well, first of all, every episode kind of one-upped itself, and certainly every season kind of one-upped itself. So the goal was always to try to get the best quality I could possibly do it in the amount of time that I was always given. And that form of preparation, that form of mixing has already carried on in myself. I've done a feature in like half the time that I would normally do it, only because of the kind of pace that we know we need to do a Maisel show. And because a Maisel show is effectively a feature in itself, one episode, it's just taught me so much more. So now when I have more time, I can actually get to a point where it's more about evaluating what I finished and taking more advantage of the time that I have, but knowing that I'm already in a great place by the time I hit that mark.
Well, that Palladino timing will carry forward. We can't wait to see what you get up to next with the next series. And congratulations again, not just for the Emmy nomination this year, but a very successful run with Maisel.
Thank you.
For everyone who's out there watching, make sure you subscribe to Gold Derby. Stick with us the rest of this season. And Ron, Matthew, thank you so much. Pleasure.
Thank you.